Good morning, happy Tuesday. One of my last days in Phoenix, and something that's recently came up for me is how hard it is for me to choose the path of least resistance and potentially the most joy, or at least more joy, and just how much that plays into my religious upbringing and how that was so demonized growing up, that how dare you choose something that, I don't know, is fulfilling or something that you truly want. In my mind, I view holiness, spirituality, and suffering as a spiritual currency of, I don't know, the more you choose to suffer, the more moral ground you have, which is ironic because, I don't know, it makes sense because in their minds, or at least super religious people in my experience, they're always the victims. They're always the ones suffering, and they're always the ones being persecuted. So of course, now that I'm out of that demographic, out of that lane, thought process, religious cult, naturally I still put myself in those positions to where I will put myself in a victim role. If there's three options, I'm going to choose the one that is the most difficult, the most miserable, the least fulfilling, the most challenging. That's why shit like 90 or 75 hard and stuff like that, or these vlogs where it's get up at 3 a.m. with me and run 20 miles. That doesn't work for me because I will take that challenge to the utmost extent because I already do that as a way of proving my worth, or worth equals suffering in my mind, which is ironic because that's not the life I want. That's not a life that I would actively choose. And it's actually something that's gotten in the way of a lot of my relationships because I resent, oh God, there's people coming. I resent the fact that, you know, people in my life would choose joy or would choose things that are fulfilling or whatever, because I feel like we're all on a team. And it's almost like the analogy of a coworker, where if all the coworkers are slacking, somebody's gonna have to pick up that workload. And the person that is choosing the option of suffering, the person that is choosing the option of suffering is going to be the one that is carrying that workload. And unfortunately, because of the way I was raised, in a lot of ways I feel like it's a pro because of the fact that I'm a great worker. My work ethic is insane. But on the other side of things, it doesn't bring a level of homeostasis because you're constantly being told that you always have to overachieve and you always have to suffer and you always have to be miserable as, like, I don't know, a way of proving yourself, being worthy and essentially being more holy, which is ironic because it actually puts you in this weird dynamic where you're judging other people for not choosing to suffer, which is so sad because you're gonna go your entire life suffering. Is this being zoomed in? Sorry guys. Oh, we're zooming in now. 1 second. Which is ironic because you're gonna choose your entire life and you're gonna live your entire life suffering, only to then, I have to remind myself of this, there is no reward at the end of your life, or there's no reward for suffering more than most. There is no reward for that. In fact, I would argue it's the opposite. I would argue you're miserable. We don't know what life we have or how much life we have or how long our life will go. Why the heck would we choose the most miserable route? That's so stupid, isn't it? It's so stupid. Granted, I think there is people that take it to the extreme on the other side of the spectrum where they're just not choosing till there's a point where you choose so much joy in the present moment that you actually would neglect your future self. There's a future version of yourself that needs you to show up for yourself in like a dedicated manner, and I understand that. But people like me that grew up in a very rigid environment, like literally most of the people that were in my cult were drill sergeants, army sergeants. We used to have in college these things where they would literally come into our dorm rooms and fine us if our beds weren't perfectly made or whatever. Granted, we were working at a call center that was extremely, rigid, and also most of the people that worked at the call center worked at the cult as well and would essentially spy on us, tell on us, etc. So we didn't get a break. We didn't get any time to just be. Just being was a sign of danger because if you were just being, you could be kicked out, judged, discriminated against. Just being was not acceptable. So I grew up in an environment where just being was viewed as not only bad, but sinful. And that really has affected me to this day. That's why I struggle with sitting still. I struggle with all of these things that maybe a normal person maybe wouldn't. But all that to say, there is no reward at the end of your life for suffering more than the person next to you. There is no spiritual currency for choosing the most miserable route in life. And why would you want to live that way? So this is your reminder. If you constantly find yourself choosing a path of resistance to the utmost extent, and you constantly find yourself, I don't know, judging other people or taking this moral higher ground for being miserable, maybe you're just miserable. And maybe that's a sign to look inward and realize there really truly is no end date in mind where you get rewarded for your suffering that you've imposed upon yourself. But one of the greatest parts about therapy for me is putting a pinpoint on all my patterns and trying to decide what actually works for me and what I actually want. Because if left unchecked, our behaviors are just repeats of patterns that we were taught and programs that we were programmed to perform that may actually be counteracting and the opposite of what we actually want out of our lives, out of others, out of our relationships. And it could be counterproductive. So really analyzing why we do those things, going back to the core of who taught us that suffering was some moral hierarchy, who taught us that choosing a path of pain or resistance or whatever was the best decision. Granted, sometimes it will be the best decision, but it's definitely not a copy and paste solution. That's for certain. It's definitely not something where, if given the option, you should just automatically go towards. And I would dissect your impulses. Dissect those things that are knee-jerk reactions to questions or things that you do, and ask yourself why you're doing them, especially whenever it's not yielding the results you actually want out of your life or out of your relationships. Because I think there's something to be said. I always go towards the inclination, right? So one of the big things for me from therapy is going towards those gut instincts. Oh, this is really pretty. I don't know if you can see that or not. Some really cute balconies. Sorry, the lighting is dark, but I always refer to it as the boogeyman in the closet, right? Where it's like you have an inclination, maybe not even a clue. Start analyzing that inclination, asking yourself questions in your spare time as to why you do certain things or have certain ideas about stuff. Or if you're noticing that something comes up for you, for me, this really got in the way of my interpersonal relationships. I would start resenting people, be angry that they weren't choosing to suffer, be angry that they weren't constantly choosing to perform or work. And that just was so counterproductive. I wasn't even enjoying the work I was doing. So why the heck was I also judging somebody else? This lighting is good. Why the heck would I also judge somebody else for not choosing to perform or not choosing to suffer? That's so dumb. And it's something we all do. Maybe not in this regard, but we're all gonna do stuff that's counterproductive to what we actually want. And the key is to just pause and analyze as much as you possibly can. And another hard part that I've had to dissect in my own interpersonal relationships is this idea of victimhood and how we're all actively choosing certain paths that put us in the driver's seat of being more of a victim than maybe would be necessary. In my own personal life, oops, I'm going the wrong way. As a kid, I grew up and I felt a lot of guilt for certain people in my life having this position of suffering. And now as I've gotten older and done the work, of course, there's definitely more tools that we have access to as a younger generation than maybe those of our parents or whatever. But to some degree, we all choose certain paths of suffering. And it's just interesting now because I'm trying to let go of some of that guilt that isn't deserved that I have on myself for being a child and seeing people around me suffer, but realizing they were all adults and they were all making active choices, whether they realized it or not, to be in that driver's seat. And just how heavy that was as a kid to carry, how much guilt children carry for other generations or other people around them, it's really heavy. So give yourself some grace and realize that a lot of the people in your life are also putting themselves in their own driver's seat. And I don't know, it's unprecedented guilt that maybe you feel. So release that from yourself and try to empower those around you. Really start using statements that allow them to take ownership for their choices and also taking ownership for your own life and your own choices. it is empowering. It's hard sometimes to own up and be the adult and be in the driver's seat of your own life. But once you realize you do have a lot more control and a lot more power and a lot more free will, then you realize it allows you to then actively make decisions that are in your best interest rather than always being the victim and then resenting those around you for not stepping up to that savior role.